Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the second round in the Nutanix Data Center Madness webinar series. I'm Scott Lowe with Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for today's head-to-head entitled Application Altercation, RDBMS versus NoSQL, and separate virtualization stacks versus integrated hypervisors. But before we get started, let's cover a few housekeeping items. Remember, at the end of today's event, we're giving away a PlayStation 4 Pro with NBA 2017. Stay to the end, and you might be today's big winner. If you have questions, ask them. We'll be taking questions at the end of the event. Just use the Q&A tab in the On24 interface and enter your question. We'll take as many questions live on the air as we possibly can. Today, we're going to talk about databases and virtualization, topics that are near and dear to many of you in the audience. Okay, everybody, you know that your business runs on data. The database landscape is changing every single day. How will enterprise applications evolve, and what types of databases will hold the petabytes of data generated in the coming years? Will it be our traditional relational database that continues to rule the data center, or will a challenger NoSQL be the new king? To help us better understand the wide world of databases, we have with us today Mike Matchett from the Tenacia Group and David Klee of Heraflux Technologies. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. And let's start with some introductions. David, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and where you do it from?
You bet. My name is David Klee, founder of Heraflux Technologies. I call myself sort of the chief technical exorcist because what we do, we work with how data in virtualization and infrastructure and cloud really work together, sometimes apart.
Mike, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure. I'm a senior industry analyst with Tenacia Group. I focus on all sorts of things, mainly around storage, but cloud management, big data, virtualization, and especially convergence, because it's all coming together today.
So, Mike, let's start with you for our very first question. Can you give us a bit of an overview regarding the current landscape as it relates to databases in today's IT environment?
Oh, I get the big picture.
You got it.
So what? Obviously the workhorse in today's data center is still the RDBMS. It's still the OLTP database. Still dominated with the likes of Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server across the landscape. That's what powers our business applications. What we're also finding when it comes to big data, which is all that new kinds of data that people have discovered in the last 10 years, where it's unstructured, it's got different velocity to it, different variety, that they're going with scale-out solutions to look at that. And there's some interesting new databases in that big data space. And then somewhere in between were our traditional BI, DW, OLAP databases, and they're sort of merging from a fairly static transactional perspective to a more columnar analytics kind of view, and you're going to find a lot of crossover in there. So there's a lot of gray area today, but the spectrum is pretty wide.
David, if you had to tell the audience the top three things that are different between our traditional, SQL Server and Oracle and things like that and NoSQL, what would those be? And include things like what they'd use them for and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. Relational it's been the king of the business world for a long time. Traditionally, these are scale-up systems. They historically, really haven't scaled out very well, but you can always throw more hardware at it, which is what a lot of people do. Generally speaking, they go up. Now, a lot of them you can scale outwards when it comes to read, but when it comes to writes, you have a single point of entry. That has to deal with that. The challenge there is how do you scale some of these things up? And you can only go up so far. But then again, how do you go out? The application has to be able to support it. The platform has to be able to support it. And that's, to me, one of the biggest challenges there. The infrastructure around it, be it memory, be it storage, data volumes are just exploding. So a lot of these database systems, they struggle with a lot of the volume. A lot of the newer technologies coming out are built to accommodate this from the ground up.
David, one of the phrases you used there was throw hardware at the problem, and I can't begin to tell you how many times I've had to do that in my past. Sometimes it's a sinking feeling because it seems wasteful. And I think when you're talking about the challenge between scale up and scale out, you're talking on the right side of things, you're talking about eventual consistency and things like that of the data. We want to make sure that we actually have write data in a way that we don't lose it, because the entire point of a database is to sort of keep our data safe. And if we think about keeping our data safe, and when we think about the requirements as we look at how we modify databases that are running, supporting our traditional applications like ERP to more next generation cloud type systems, what are some of the differences that people are going to have to get over? What are some of the changes they're going to have to face as they start to look at more cloud-like applications? Mike, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, clearly the infrastructure that we've been running in the past isn't going to cut it. And we're going to have new kinds of infrastructure moving forward to really handle the different kinds of scale-out solutions that you're talking about. Part of what we're going to see are new processors, more in-memory, more dedicated use of server-side flash, for example. We're going to see more containerized kinds of databases and micro-threading where you can do computation in the database. So there's a lot of changes coming to handle that new world that you're talking about.
David, one of the things that Mike just mentioned was the idea of containers. I mean, this is sort of an ancillary topic, but what do you see, if anything, is the role for that as we start to look at different types of database applications and moving to the future?
I love it. I love the concept of containers. I know the future is bright for them. The question is it the right use case? So to be able to take an entire application stack and essentially shift it without having to worry about the operating system is wonderful. The question is, what about security? What about availability? What about data replication for high availability, disaster recovery? These are all the things that we really have to worry about. So the challenge there is, will the app be able to be resilient enough to let these things happen under the hood? And these are the things that really matter, especially when at cloud technologies, especially when it comes to business critical apps that really can have no downtime whatsoever. And these are the challenges that we face right now as this landscape is just constantly evolving.
You know, David, one of the things that we hear a lot about is this idea that we're in a transition period between having to support legacy applications and having to support some of these cloud-native applications. Are there options out there that can help provide the best of both worlds, and especially as we think about it in terms of infrastructure? I mean, obviously we have, the infrastructure differences here are going to be vast. And if we look at our traditional versus our emerging infrastructure options, there's a lot of different opportunities out there. Can you talk briefly to what you see as sort of some of the opportunities out there that people have right now? And then Mike will ask you the same question.
Yeah, well, I mean, the challenge there is, where do you start? If you're looking at hardware resiliency, you've got on-prem virtualization, and that's been around for a while. It works great. You can basically insulate yourself, not cut it out, but you can insulate from a single piece of hardware that's going to fail. It happens. But now you got to worry about application HA, load balancing, database scale-out technologies. You want to make the system self-heal, but you also need to worry about insulating this from an individual outage, and that's where fault tolerance, that's where some of the more robust database HA solutions come into play, actually with scale-out applications. In the cloud, you definitely have to worry about it, because in the cloud, stuff can move around all the time. Stuff can get disconnected all the time. And if it's under 5 or 10 seconds, most of the time it doesn't even count against a vendor's SLA for availability. And that's not good. So we really have to worry about a lot of that stuff. Now, there are technologies out there. Virtualization has got it. The database layer are guaranteed to have some sort of HA technology. There are pieces that you can put in the middle of the database and the app to really buffer that some more. The application, hopefully it scales out pretty well. But these are all things you really have to worry about from day one.
Mike, as you look at companies that are in sort of this converged, hyper-converged space, including Nutanix, how do you think that they're helping to address this transition from the old to the new?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of what Dave was getting at was pointing to the right solution is probably going to be a hybrid one in which we are using the best of what we can run on-premise for performance and HA and fault tolerance while leveraging the cloud for distribution capacity and so on. And if we got a little bit deeper into talking about databases themselves, we'd see that a lot of the emerging databases are going in that direction where they can stitch together data stores in all these different places and put together even a data grid, if you will, of stuff. But we pull back and we look at the kind of hardware that you need. It's definitely moving towards a converged or even hyper-converged system, as you mentioned, Nutanix is a great example. One of the benefits that these kinds of platforms provide is the ability to support primarily mixed workloads. And when I say mixed workloads, it's not a single kind of process that's running. It's not optimized for just a compute-intensive process, or just an IO-intensive process, or just even a SQL Server profile, if you will. These are systems that are capable of handling mixed workloads and running them side by side and providing the isolation, fault tolerance, and redundancy that you really need at scale, and they're scale-out kinds of systems. So that's where I'd be looking if I was looking at a new data center design.
Mike, as you look at this idea that we need to scale out, we need to have a data center infrastructure environment that can help support that. What does it mean for the underlying database software? I mean, does this help us? Can we go relational or NoSQL or in memory, or does it really matter? Can we just do whatever we want, wherever we want, as long as we have the right solution?
Not quite sure on the exact question there, but you can't just do whatever you want, that's for sure. When you are looking at database designs and you're going from a scale-up database to a scale-out database, you mentioned before things like eventual consistency, and those are definitely things that you track. But there are some databases now that are bringing full ANSI SQL kinds of semantics with low latency to really what you consider a scale-out kind of Hadoop-like clustered environment. So there are cutting-edge databases now emerging that allow someone to converge OLTP semantics and transactions with full big data kinds of what you might think of as MapReduce kinds of queries. They're no longer MapReduce, but you get the picture that operational systems and analytical systems are converging. People want to bring things that they were doing in analytical databases into their operational real-time streaming kinds of transactional business processes. So those are coming together, and as we see that level of the database converge, and that the underlying infrastructure has to be able to support now a wide range of functionality, and I guess the basic word I would say is computability. It has to really provide for scale up in the case of adding more memory and flash per node, and scale out in the sense of providing more capacity and being able to support a distributed architecture.
David, your thoughts?
Couldn't have said it better. The platform has to be able to scale, because if you're going to just arbitrarily throw workloads at it, it's got to be able to handle everything. So from a storage perspective, it's got to be fast. From a CPU perspective, it's got to be fast and have a lot of cores. The memory requirements of a lot of these, since the assumption is that the working set of RAM is holding the working data, so you've got to have a lot of RAM, a lot of CPU, a lot of fast storage, and a lot of scale of storage as well, because the volume of data is just blowing up in our faces. So it's got to be able to flex and scale and really accommodate, and be able to have you add things into that resource pool without having any downtime or disruption of the business critical app.
David, one of the things you just mentioned really I think is important, the data explosion. What do you think? Let's get into the weeds for just a second. I don't want to go too deep into technical details, but what about the role of things like deduplication and compression and storage? How important are they to the future database workload?
Oh, they're incredible. They're absolutely incredible. I've got one environment that I'm working on right now. They need 0.5 petabyte of online storage to store 2 days worth of database backups locally in their environment. Their storage does not deduplicate. All you need is a layer there that does, and that's 0.25 petabyte that you save just to keep a day extra online. It's amazing.
Mike, what are your thoughts on that as far as underlying infrastructure, underlying storage capabilities? What are your thoughts on how important those kinds of features are to the future?
Yeah, I think the storage layer, a lot of people said storage is kind of dead, and it was dying industry a couple years ago. But what we see is that it's really encompassing a lot more services these days. It's encompassing, you mentioned dedupe and compression for capacity optimization. We're also seeing performance optimization in the way some things are arranging records and returning table spaces. We're also seeing encryption, which is becoming really critical for a lot of people, especially in a hybrid cloud, being done at a lower level in the hardware and done in the infrastructure. We're seeing things like thin provisioning really being important as well, as you might want to do some leverage of copies without making full copies. You want to make thin clones and use those in test and dev and so on. You don't want to take your 0.5 petabyte data set and just make a copy of it to do a dev test, right? So there's lots of things going on in the storage services part of the world that are becoming really fundamental to operating in this new big data space.
Gentlemen, thank you both for being here today to help us better understand the database landscape that we're facing today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Scott. Thanks, David.
Now, let's ask you, the audience, a question. We want to understand what your thoughts and challenges are around the topics that we're discussing today. On your screen, you'll see a question. We'll give you a minute to answer it, and while you're doing so, we'll bring in our next speakers.
You should see a poll question on your screen now. Please answer the question, and while we're waiting for you to answer that question and bringing our new speakers in, I'd like to remind you that we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your window. We would encourage you to ask any questions you might have around today's topics. We will have David Davis and David Klee joining us at the very end of the webcast to answer any live questions you may have about the topics that we're talking about today. If you don't see the question on your screen, look behind the video window. Unfortunately, on 24, we were notified, and we did this last week, sometimes shows the question behind the video window. If you don't see it, please let me know in the Q&A, and we can try to take care of it after the event.
Hey everyone, we're back. And here are the results from the poll questions that we asked right before the break.
A number of you answered our poll question, and as you can see, the top reasons you continue to use a separate virtualization stack, this is going to be the topic of our next discussion, is primarily around existing investment and overall performance of application and storage. So basically what this tells us is what you have is working, but there may be opportunity for, when you're moving forward, to look at a more integrated virtualization stack rather than a separate one. And over 8% of you said you've already moved to a system that has an integrated hypervisor.
Now, let's move on to the next part of our event and talk about the workhorse of the data center, the hypervisor. Now, really, the market has embraced virtualization as the norm for just about all the workloads we run in the data center. But does it make sense for applications and virtual machines to run on a separately deployed virtualization stack? Or has the hypervisor just become another integrated feature? Joining us for this discussion are Joop Piskar, who operates virtuallifestyle.nl, and David Davis from Actual Tech Media. Guys, can you tell us a little bit about you, starting with Joop?
Yeah, sure. I'm Joop Piskar. I'm a blogger on virtuallifestyle.nl. I'm the CTO of a local Dutch outsourcer, OGD. And I've been running production systems with virtualization for over a decade.
And David, you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, Scott. I'm David Davis from Actual Tech Media, and I'm a longtime virtualization admin, a video training author, and author of just a lot of content around virtualization. Over the years, I also implemented virtualization very early, back around 2008, in a production data center, and really fell in love with it. Ever since then.
And you're sort of seen as an expert on virtualization from the courses you've done for Pluralsight, so we don't want to overshadow that because that's important.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I've created over 50 video training courses for Pluralsight.com, with most of them around VMware vSphere, virtualization, and cloud computing.
So Joop, let's ask you the first question, and let's get a discussion going around it. Is the hypervisor of today, is it a product or is it a feature?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. So I'm not sure which way to lean. Right now, I would say the hypervisor has just become a feature. I don't really care about it anymore. I know it's there. I know it works. I know what to expect from it. And I don't actually think I would ever, actually invest a lot of time in researching a hypervisor right now.
David, when you think about the different state of the hypervisor in the market, obviously we look at, we look at the options that are out there, and they're relatively feature comparable. I mean, what are your thoughts on choosing a hypervisor, and is it a choice people really need to be making at this point, or is it more about the ecosystem? What's it about?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the hypervisor, I hate to say it's just become a commodity because it hasn't totally, because like you said, there's a lot more to it than just that. So not every hypervisor is going to be exactly the same. It is important to have a hypervisor, of course.
Right.
We got to have a hypervisor. But then after that, to me, it's all about the advanced features. What advanced features does that hypervisor offer? And then, like you said, what's the ecosystem around that hypervisor? What kind of knowledge base, material is available to help me implement that hypervisor? What about consulting groups? Are they educated and up to speed on that? What about my team, my virtualization admins or my server admins, whoever's going to be taking care of this, virtualization infrastructure? What's their knowledge level and what tools are available to help them, and even third-party, tools for that hypervisor. So that's what I think of when I think of, which hypervisor would I implement in a new data center.
As we look at some of the questions you just raised around the ecosystem and stuff like that, the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure plays a huge role in that. And as we look at some of the emerging or emerged at this point data center architectural options that are out there, like hyperconverged infrastructure, it's really brought the hypervisor question back to the forefront, though. It used to be that you choose VMware and you just go on your way. But now we've got a choice there, and the hypervisor, or the hyperconverged vendors, for example, are adding so much more that the hypervisor becomes sort of an afterthought. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, am I totally off base there, or do you think that there's something to that?
No, I completely agree, to be honest. So like David mentioned, the ecosystem is pretty important, right? You want to have monitoring, you want to have backup, you want to have a good logging system in place. So the third-party ecosystem for the hypervisor is still pretty important. And I think that the HCI vendors are now really looking into expanding that ecosystem around the hypervisor solutions they've developed, because they do realize that customer choice in terms of, like I mentioned, the backup or the monitoring or security systems or even network virtualization is the key driver to actually choosing a hypervisor. It's not the hypervisor itself, it's the ecosystem, it's the integration. And I think that we're going to see the expansion of the development of the hypervisor in the next year or so.
I completely agree with everything you just said. I think there's a lot of inertia around what we've done around the ecosystem, but I think that's slowly shifting to what's happening with new architectures that are becoming available in the market. But when we think about some of the reasons that people are thinking about this idea of moving away from some of the established hypervisor products that are on the market to something that's more integrated with infrastructure, what are some of the reasons that they are looking at making this change? David, what are some of your thoughts on that?
I mean, when you implement new infrastructure in the data center, let's say you need new compute and new storage. In many cases, it's become more of a commodity purchase. Companies are looking more at the return on investment of that infrastructure, not at what hypervisor is a part of that. And I think as the integrated hypervisor solutions have become more mature, the advanced features have become, feature parity with, let's say, VMware vSphere, and it makes it harder for, entrenched admins to say no to that. I mean, if it checks all the boxes of what they need in the data center, and the return on investment is going to be, better than what they're using now, it's hard to turn that down.
When you think about an integrated hypervisor, how do you think about it in ways that it could potentially reduce costs, if any?
So the major driver for me is the integration itself. So if I get a hypervisor built into the HCI solution, and I don't actually need to manage it or upgrade it in a separate process, that's the real cost driver for me. It helps my team to free up their time to do stuff that actually is important, that actually delivers value, instead of patching and upgrading and keeping it running. And I think there's a real chance for those integrated hypervisors to really shine and to kind of beat the king of the hill in that space.
One of the things we have to think about in terms of the hypervisor as well is management. Obviously, we have to manage these infrastructure environments because those are really important. And when we think about traditional hypervisor solutions, we're also buying a management platform that gives us tons of bells and whistles, gives us all kinds of features. My question is, when we think about management software in an integrated hypervisor, it's just typically the management's integrated as well, but it may not have every single feature that we've come to expect, or not even expect, it's probably too strong a word, but that we've come to see. Do you think that the integrated hypervisors are feature complete enough, including on the management side, that they are workable for most organizations?
Yeah, I mean, the integrated hypervisor solutions I've seen recently have really been impressive to me in terms of what they can do. In many cases, say high availability for the management platform is just built into the product. In many cases, there's advanced features that I might have had to pay for, in my traditional hypervisor, much more, maybe that are just automatically built in. Maybe things like replication and disaster recovery, all just automatically built in. So I've been really impressed with what they're doing, with hyperconvergent solutions and integrated hypervisors these days.
What are your thoughts on that with the same question?
Well, I kind of agree, right? So I think the state of the hypervisor and the management tooling around it in say the last 6 months have been, the developments have been tremendous, and I think the feature parity is already there, and especially if you look at it from a different angle, right? So usually the more premium features are around DR or storage management, and that's a field where the HCI vendors are traditionally pretty strong in, because that is where they started out actually. So I kind of think that the feature parity goes beyond what the traditional platforms are offering right now, simply because they had a different starting point.
So let's go a little deeper. I mean, we've talked about sort of the hypervisor and the management, but let's actually dig down on the technology for a second. One of the things we think about in terms of software-defined storage or hyperconverged infrastructure is we have this idea that we can scale out. So as we need more capacity, we simply add another appliance, and we then add the software that we need. But part of the challenge is that as we add that software, we have to add hypervisor licenses to go along with it, right? Because of the way that we're handling the scale-out environment. When we start to think about less expensive scaling opportunities with not having to buy hyperconverged licenses for new storage capacity, do you think that's a compelling enough reason for people to think about, hey, we need to be really thinking about this integrated hypervisor thing versus continuing to buy sort of this stuff separately? Huub, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a good question. So that whole scale-out architecture does bring these licensing issues with it. And I think it's smart to specifically in those architectures look at a hypervisor that is doesn't incur that same license cost, because if you want to actually if you want to keep scaling out, there's going to be a license cost that might or might not be in line with the business expects. And I think that is one of the logical consequences of doing HCI, which haven't been battle tested yet. And I think that that is something the industry needs to prove itself to be flexible and change those licensing terms as well.
David, same question. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I've kind of looked at the hyperconvergent solutions almost like an iPhone, where you buy an iPhone and the software just comes on it, and many of the advanced features are just built into it. And when a new iOS version, let's say, comes out, it just is automatically upgraded, and you get new features along with that. And I think that's a great user experience. You don't have to think about licensing for your phone and features and upgrades. And so, many of the hyperconvergent solutions where they have integrated hypervisors and they have advanced functionality, I've really been impressed, when it comes to scaling out. Just add another node, the hypervisor is included with that, the advanced features are included. When new features come out, you automatically get those features built in. So I think it's a great solution for scalability.
For me, I see the integrated hypervisor as important, especially as we move to a more scale-out based world. And the reason I say that is because we're scaling out for generally storage capacity, not for CPU and RAM. And so we're not needing a place to actually operate virtual machines. We're needing we need appliances that we can have for more storage. And why would we have to pay for hypervisor license to add more storage? And that's one of the challenges I think people are working on, trying to figure out what does this mean for that. So David, what do you see as the future of virtualization management?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, if I were to get my crystal ball, I really see the hypervisor becoming less and less important, and people really focusing on the features, that the hypervisor brings, and even elevating it to a higher level. Looking at private cloud, public cloud, and just looking at the infrastructure as just a giant resource pool. And it doesn't matter so much, where you run it exactly, and you just have the same expectations of that resource pool, and of high availability and performance and everything that your company needs. So what's your take on that, Scott?
Same thing. I think that we're looking at a world, obviously we're moving far more towards cloud than we did. We're going to start bringing in non-virtualized workloads that may have been physical before in some cases, or cloud-based, but they're going to be running everywhere. And we're also going to be bringing in different kinds of virtualization, like containers and things like that. So I see this sort of fragmenting in some ways and converging in other ways, and it's going to be a pretty exciting time.
Absolutely.
Joop and David, thank you for sharing your insight regarding the state of the world of the hypervisor.
And it's now time to do some Q&A. And we have with us on the line, we have David Davis and David Klee, who are going to be here live to take some questions. David and David, are you both here?
I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you both for being here for Q&A. David Davis, we're going to start with you. And I think this is a really interesting question because it's something that a lot of people face. And the first question is, how does someone with limited time and research do due diligence to see what benefits the third-party vendors bring to hyperconverged infrastructure? Put simply, it can get overwhelming to look at all of these different vendors. But he still wants to be able to, maybe run VMware on a platform, but maybe go hyperconverged. What are some of the ways that they can evaluate a bunch of vendors back to back, or just look at some different options with limited time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've been there myself, an IT manager with limited time, and really want to innovate on what's hot and new. And so, there's a few different ways. I mean, traditionally, I think IT folks have counted on their value-added reseller to do some of that for them. But VARs don't always represent every, let's say, hyperconvergence vendor out there. So you could go to user group meetings, conferences, things like that. One of the things that I've been doing with Actual Tech Media is these megacast series where we have, let's say, 6 to 8 hyperconvergence vendors all back to back on one day, and they present all at one time. And of course, those are recorded, and there's those types of events that come up in the future. So there's a lot of different options to learn about hyperconvergence and get yourself up to speed.
David Klee, the next question is for you. And the question is, can you elaborate on ways how data is in structured and unstructured environments can be integrated and sort of used collectively in sort of business intelligence purposes?
Absolutely. Yeah, in structured environments, there have been historical measures and means to integrate a lot of this data for a long time. There's any sort of mechanism to actually go query a relational database. It's a pretty static schema. There are a lot of different integration utilities out there, and you can fetch, you can query against remote machines, you can extract it and pull it into different machines for grouping and joining different sets of data. With unstructured, it gets a little more interesting. The schemas are a little more loosely defined, so you've got to be a little more careful with this. Now, you can still extract and go move into different systems, but the document storage format may be a little bit different. Schemas may be a little less strict. There may be some dependencies between data that may be a little more interesting. But if you've got a good handle on the data, it really shouldn't be too bad. It just takes a little bit more elbow grease.
It seems like that's been the beauty of the relational database system since the 1970s, is the fact that it's very structured, it's very consistent, it enables really quite accurate and detailed analysis, and it's reliable enough to help automate business processes and help drive decision making. But it seems like we're still sort of in the frontier period with how we're going to use unstructured data to help propel us forward in the same ways. Would you say that's an accurate statement, or am I totally off base there?
No, I completely agree. What we're seeing right now is that this Wild West mentality of a lot of the NoSQL startups. We're finding that they're starting to add more of a relational series of constructs into it. For example, now you've got some option to have a little bit more strict definition of the data, whereas with a lot of the SQL technologies, you're actually finding that a lot of them are adding some of the NoSQL constructs to make things a little more flexible, a little bit more easily integratable and flexible with a lot of the speed of a lot of the movement on these apps. So it's kind of interesting to watch them both they're both at opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're both slowly kind of creeping towards each other.
So the next question I'll actually take, and the question is, how do hypervisors compare with containers? And that's an apple versus oranges question, because it's not really an us versus them sort of thing when you talk about containers. Hypervisors have become incredibly useful for abstracting at the hardware level. So we're going to run a virtual machine, we're going to put an operating system in that virtual machine, and we're going to run a bunch of applications or an application inside that virtual machine. With containers, what we do is it's not really virtualization. I mean, you can consider it virtualization to a point in some ways, but it's just a different way to run applications. We're going to basically do a bunch of shared libraries on a single operating system instance. And that operating system instance can run on bare metal, or it can run in a virtualized environment. So when you talk about going one or the other, it's not necessarily an accurate representation of reality, because you can actually do both. So you can run your container-based workloads in your existing environment on whatever hypervisor you happen to have, or you can run them on bare metal. So bear that in mind when you're looking at the question between which one should I choose for moving forward. You can do both. The next question is for David Davis, and this is around cloud. Do you think the cost of overall going to the cloud is going to come down? And do you think it's cheaper to self-host or to move into the public cloud? Or is the answer, as always, it depends?
I hate to cop out and say it depends, because none of us like to hear that answer. But of course, the cost of the cloud, I don't know that it's actually coming down. To me, it's all about control and security and things like that. If you're representing your company, it's your job to keep your company's data safe. It's your job to manage your company's data, ensure it's highly available and the applications are performing well. And so to me, it comes back to control. Which applications are you willing to put into the cloud and maybe give up a little bit of control? And which applications do you want to keep on premises and have maximum control and flexibility with that data and with those applications? So it's hard to always just look at it strictly from a cost perspective, because there's so many more other important aspects when it comes to what you should and should not move to the cloud infrastructure.
And David Klee, the last question is for you, and it's a relatively general one, and it's, why do I want to use NoSQL?
General answer, why not? The interest, well, the fun part about NoSQL is that you've got flexibility. You've got the ability to put in really unstructured data. So if you've got a lot of data streams coming in from all over the place, if you've got just sources coming in all over, if you've got things that are constantly changing, and we know how fast software development life cycles really do change things, then getting in and trying to change data types, trying to change table definitions, and all the constructs that go along with that, it might make life a lot more complicated and a lot more convoluted to go do that in a SQL engine. Conversely, you may not want to go to it if you do want a little bit more strict control over the data. So it's all a trade-off there.
Gentlemen, David and David, thank you for being here for the Q&A portion of today's event.
Thanks, Scott.
Cool. Thank you.
And with that, we'll move on.
Thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you learned everything you ever wanted to know about databases and hypervisors. And we have one more incredibly important thing to do. We have to give someone a PlayStation 4 Pro with NBA 2017.
And today's lucky winner is Dmitry Gertsev from Oregon in the U.S. Dmitry, Nutanix will be reaching out to you after the event with information on how to collect your winnings. Congratulations to our winner today. And don't forget, at the end of this entire series, we'll be giving away a pair of signed by Michael Jordan shoes, and that will be in 2 weeks. And don't forget to come back next week for part 3 of our March Madness event as well.
And congratulations to our lucky winner, and thank you to everyone for attending today's live event. Make sure to come back next week at the same time when we'll tackle DevOps, containers, and VMs. In the meantime, have a great week.